Jack Rattenbury looked at his comrades and said, "We deserve a reward." And their reply to him was, "We do." The day before, they had sailed across the channel to Alderney, where they'd loaded up the ship with barrels, which meant carrying barrels from shore to boat, from boat to ship. And then overnight, they crewed the ship back across the channel, arriving and anchoring just off the coast here at Beer, and then reversing the process, bringing barrels from ship to boat, from boat to shore, and then from shore up into caves. Caves all over the cliffs, either side of the beach here at Beer. They were tired. They were hot, despite it being November. They were sweaty, they were dirty, and they were thirsty. So we can guess what the reward was going to be. So they set off. Once everything was stowed away safely, up into the village. Jack and his crew came up the hill to the first inn as you go into the village of Beer, the Anchor Inn. And when they pushed the door open, they saw in front of them a welcoming fire, and in front of the fire, a settle. A settle is like a wooden bench with a high wooden back. And they sat down and they enjoyed their ale and they toasted each other. To Jack Rattenbury, the Rob Roy of the West. To Jack Rattenbury, a smuggler's smuggler, the slipperiest of men, a sailor's sailor. But a settle can have two sides. You've got the high wooden back and you've got a bench, but on the other side there can also be another bench, and on the other side of the bench was sitting Sergeant Hill and some of the militia. And Sergeant Hill heard the name Jack Rattenbury. Now, Jack Rattenbury was a smuggler, but he was also a deserter from the Royal Navy, and he was a wanted man. Jack was looking in his tankard and reflecting on how quickly a tankard could go from being so full to being so almost empty, when he realized he was no longer getting the benefit from that wonderful fire. He looked up and saw that there were men standing between him and the warmth of the fire, and he was about to tell them to move out of the way when he noticed their uniforms, the uniforms of the militia. And Sergeant Hill looked at Jack and said, "You are Jack Rattenbury. You are a deserter. You're my prisoner and you must come with me." And as he spoke, Jack's friends seemed to dissolve and disappear as they left his side and lost themselves in the crowd in the inn. Jack, a smuggler's smuggler, the most slippery of men, well, he was used to getting out of any kind of trouble with his tongue and his lips. And so he tried to persuade Sergeant Hill. "Jack who? No, I've never heard of this person. It's not me," but this time it wasn't going to work. The sergeant knew he had his man. Jack looked about down in his tankard at the little bit of ale that was left at the bottom, and he said to the sergeant, "Oh, Sergeant, can't you and I drink together?" And he threw the beer into the sergeant's face. The sergeant automatically took a step back, as did his men, and Jack took the opportunity. For alongside him was the cellar door, and the cellar door was open. The opening to the cellar was set at an angle between the floor and the wall, and he jumped down into the darkness of the cellar. There was some light spilling from the bar into the cellar, but Jack pressed himself into the shadows. Sergeant Hill stood at the opening to the cellar with some of his men and said, "Come on, Jack, you know you can't escape." Jack felt around for a way out from the cellar, but there wasn't one. And in the shadows he could see the shapes of empty barrels and empty boxes and old furniture. He felt around for a weapon. He found a table leg. That was useless. He felt around and he caught himself on something sharp. Gingerly, with his fingers, he traced a blade and a handle, and he lifted up a reaping hook. And a reaping hook is like a very large sickle. And he held the reaping hook out into the middle of the cellar so that the light from the bar fell upon it. And he called up to Sergeant Hill, "Any man who comes down here, I'll gut him. I'll kill him." Sergeant Hill looked at the reaping hook in the light from the bar spilling down into the cellar, and he looked at his men and said, "Get in there and seize him." The men looked at the reaping hook, and then they looked at the sergeant, and one of them said, "Well, it's your proposition. Why don't you show us how?" And the other one said, "You set an example and we'll follow." And Sergeant Hill did what any good non-commissioned officer would do. He said, "I'm going to get an officer. Lieutenant Durrell's in one of the rooms upstairs. I'll send for him." So Sergeant Hill went off to send for Lieutenant Durrell, who had accommodation in the rooms above in the inn. And while Sergeant Hill was giving the orders and the man went to get Lieutenant Durrell, Jack in the cellar was thinking what he could do. He needed some kind of distraction, something that would take the attention of the soldiers so that he could jump out of the cellar and run through them. Lieutenant Durrell came down from his rooms, not in a good mood because he was resting, and Sergeant Hill explained that they had a deserter. They had Jack Rattenbury trapped in the cellar. Just at that moment, the door to the inn behind them was thrown open and a near hysterical woman came into the bar shouting, "Lawks! Lawks! Lord have mercy! Will no one come and save him?" The soldiers all turned to face her. Lieutenant Durrell and Sergeant Hill turned to face her as she said, "Oh, out in the bay there is a child drowning. Will none of you brave men come and help and save this poor child?" The soldiers were distracted. Sergeant Hill was distracted. Lieutenant Durrell, oh yeah, he was distracted. And so Jack jumped out of the cellar, ran through the soldiers, between Sergeant Hill and That's not going to work, is it? I mean, if he runs between them, they're just going to grab hold of his clothes, aren't they? So let's just rewind a moment back to before the woman came in. And Sergeant Hill was explaining the situation to Lieutenant Durrell, and Jack was thinking he needed a distraction, but he also realised the clothes he was wearing were a problem. So he stripped off, putting his boots back on again, obviously. And he thought about the state of his body. Remember that he had been in Alderney and had then carried barrels from shore to boat, from boat to ship, had crewed a ship across the channel and then taken barrels from ship to boat, from boat to shore, from shore to caves, and then he had been sitting in front of a roaring fire. Oh, he was dirty and he was sweaty. So he rubbed the sweat all over his body. And at that point, the door to the inn was thrown open and the near hysterical woman appeared. "Oh, Lawks, Lawks, Lord have mercy! Will no one save the poor child who is drowning in the bay?" Everyone was distracted and Jack took his chance. He jumped out of the cellar and ran through the soldiers. Jack, the slipperiest of men, because every soldier that tried to get hold of him found that he couldn't get purchase as his hands slid off Jack's body. And as he ran past the woman, he winked at her. And then he ran between Lieutenant Durrell and Sergeant Hill and out of the inn. Jack ran from the inn, down the street, onto the beach he ran. By the sea, his friends were standing by their boat, waiting for him. The friends that had been in the inn and had gone to persuade that woman to create a distraction, they jumped into the boat and rowed out to Jack's ship. Lieutenant Durrell and Sergeant Hill were running down the beach after them, but it was too late, because by the time they reached the seashore, Jack Rattenbury was on his ship once more, hopefully covering his embarrassment, but he was able to raise his colours as an act of defiance against Lieutenant Durrell, who stood on the shore and shouted in fury at Jack Rattenbury, the smuggler's smuggler. Literally the slipperiest of men and a sailor's sailor.